the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without motion anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we just want to mention briefly we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. Today, we're very pleased to bring you Kara Kennedy, whose publications include the book Adaptations of Dune, Frank Herbert's story on screen, Frank Herbert's Dune, A Critical Companion, and Women's Agency in the Dune Universe, Tracing Women's Liberation Through Science Fiction, as well as various articles on Dune topics. And then you've even developed your own coursework, which I didn't put that in the notes, but we may have to hear a little bit about that. I'd be interested to see what direction you go, but we're super excited to do something a little bit different. Normally, I'm like pigeonholing Dune into the episodes, so this is a nice reversal of that process. So we'd like to start out typically with what we've sort of referred to as your philosophical origin story. So this could take the form of an intensive encounter, a moment, a thinker, some sort of maybe singularity in your life that got you on the road, this road of both Dune and philosophy. If you want to kind of merge those or build off of those two, that certainly would be great. Really, whatever you want to share in that realm, we'd be definitely interested to hear what you have to say.
This was an interesting question. I've thought about Dune in terms of origin story before, but not necessarily the philosophical question. So I first read Dune when I was a teenager, which is, I think, the best time to read it for the first time. And my dad had a copy of the whole original 6 books. And it was the one with the brown and orange cover, and something about the spine just really intrigued me. It just kind of looked like a dirty, dusty book on there. And I finally just thought, what is going on with this book? Like, who would market a book like this? And I ended up reading it and I just loved it. And I was just hooked and I just devoured the rest of the series. And unfortunately, I never got the chance to study science fiction like in school or even in university. I had a very classical literary degree. And so for my final year honors project as an undergrad, I asked, hey, could I study my favorite science fiction book instead of something like Shakespeare or something more traditional? And they said, sure, and that was like it. I focused on studying Jessica, and I've been studying the women of Dune pretty much ever since. But in terms of philosophy, it was a similar time, I'd say high school. I came across some feminist writers, like books by feminists, American feminists. And also at the same time, I was doing Model United Nations, where you represent a country and you have like 2 assigned issues. And one of the issues that year just happened to be women in governance. And so the country I was assigned was Slovenia. And I had to do all this research about what's this issue, women in governance, why aren't there more women in governance and leadership positions around the world? And that kind of just opened a whole can of worms of really giving me a global perspective on women's issues that I just hadn't really thought about before. But that process of having to research and look up all these pretty terrible statistics about, we seem to be quite far along from the feminist movement. And yet we don't really have that many women in leadership positions and governance positions around the world. And I think that's really what set me off on studying feminism and using a feminist perspective to look at the representation of women in literature. That was really interested in English literature. So I kind of put those things together, and I can and I do write about other things besides just, feminist philosophical theory and how it applies to literature. But that's really where that's like my lane, I guess, that I really like. And for some reason, Dune's been quite understudied. and no one had really written about it before. And so I'm really trying to reclaim that space and give Herbert some credit for before the women's movement really took off in the 60s and 70s, and before the feminist sci-fi really took off in the 70s. He was doing some really incredible things with the Bene Gesserit that I think is really interesting and we should pay more attention to.
I noticed that in your introduction to the women in Dune, I thought that was fascinating how even when the women were noticed as having a prominent position, it was generally seen as still being reactionary on Herbert's part. And your study kind of begs to differ. It may not be, the most radical liberatory, but to downplay the actual work, I guess, that went into how much power women wield, or their roles in Dune being a little bit more complex than one might think from a quote unquote reactionary. I thought your thesis was pretty compelling, and you can already see some of that in the companion, which is what we read for today. But I was trying to peek over into a little deeper into the topic, because you convinced me very much. It's like, yeah, why would that go unacknowledged? And perhaps it's because these other narratives, like the Messiah narrative or the quote unquote hero anti-hero narrative, gets all the talk, or ecology, and those are important too. But it is interesting that topic, as you said, was so overlooked.
And I have nothing against Ursula Le Guin. She's usually credited as like the first science fiction writer to really push kind of gender into the forefront. But Left Hand of Darkness came out in '69, and there's one woman in the whole story because she uses the masculine pronouns. And so a lot of people read those characters, even though they're supposed to be flexible with becoming male or female. You read it as a story of two men going on an adventure still. And so I thought, okay, well, if she can be celebrated for that, then can we also celebrate this male author who was doing some really interesting stuff before then and actually has a whole group of women in it who have incredible abilities. And there's a lot to unpack there. And you really have to get past the idea of the roles. I think people get hung up on, because it's a feudal kind of medieval setting, women are not in the official positions of power. And so I think it's really easy to look at that and discredit them. That's not what you do if you're a scholar, right? You look past the surface level. So I was quite disappointed in how many scholars have really just overlooked them or downplayed them. So I thought, well, it's my job to give the counter perspective and bring all the evidence that I can to support that.
Speaking of that book, it was interesting. I was looking through it just a little while ago too, just to kind of fill in some more, inspire some new questions. And I saw that you had cited Elizabeth Gross, who we just had on the show maybe a month ago or something like that. And she was just such a powerhouse. She was really amazing. I was really inspired by her passion and just earnestness when we spoke with her. So she in particular is someone that has this kind of interesting angle on feminism, but also like she appreciates Nietzsche. And I think that maybe Herbert is he's certainly like an unorthodox person with regard, I don't know if he's an out and out reactionary entirely, but he certainly kind of is very heterodox.
Yeah, Elizabeth Gross. I was probably just name dropping her more so than looking at her work, because I really focus on Simone de Beauvoir in terms of like the dualism. But I think that's this problem of the body just keeps being a problem for women, because in science fiction as well, there's a lot of stories about how do we get out of our body, how do we take our mind and put it in another body or put it in a way, a computer. And so this idea that we don't need our body, that really what makes us human is just our mind and our memories. That's just really been problematic for women, because women are so embodied, especially with things like pregnancy and motherhood and those kinds of things. And so this idea that you don't need your body, that all you are is a mind, really discounts all of the things your body does and all the perceptions and how your body is completely intertwined with other parts of you. And I think for Herbert, reaching over into Eastern philosophy was his way to get around that problem. And I thought that he did a really interesting job, especially with the Bene Gesserit, of showing how a more holistic view of the human can be a really interesting way to think about ourselves, instead of just we're just a mind and mind's the only thing that's important. I think you can see through the mentats, I think his critique of that idea that the mind and logic are the supreme everything, because his mentats keep being wrong.
It's weird though too that he also, I was just thinking about, you were mentioning this preservation of the mind and so forth. It's interesting with regard to like the Tleilaxu and not only the concept of the Golas and reawakening the past memories of the Golas, but also like the way that reproduction is carried out in the Tleilaxu society with the axolotl tanks, which are supposedly women, the Tleilaxu women. Have you read much? I can't even remember where in the canon that is really drawn out. I don't know if you'd want to speak to any of that. I know I'm getting a little bit intense here already, but if you have any,
that comes through in the later, the last two books really focus on the Bene Gesserit versus this other female group, the Honored Martyrs, and the Tleilaxu are kind of one of the antagonists besides the Honored Martyrs. And I think with the Tleilaxu, we see kind of Herbert's critique of science that he starts developing in the first one with Dr. Kynes, and ecologists don't know everything, scientists don't know everything. And how I read the Tleilaxu is that these are scientists that have gone way outside the bounds of kind of humanity, and they've taken reproduction, they've taken what is something that historically women have controlled, and they've said, we don't need women, we don't need mothers, we're just going to use science to make babies and to genetically alter them however we want, to craft them to play God. And I think reading those stories through Herbert's lens, that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing for society. It's a bad thing for women. It's a twisted way to do reproduction. But even then, the Bene Gesserit come to this practical realization that, hey, if we want to survive, maybe we're going to have to start doing things that are unnatural, that are outside of what we feel comfortable with. And so reckoning with what would you do if you had to survive, you might have to start doing some things that you didn't previously want to do. But I don't think you can read the Tleilaxu in a positive way as Herbert presents them as characters.
It certainly goes along with, I think, the instrumentality or instrumentalization of reproduction through the bodies of women that, we have in our own society, drawing out that logic to its utter extreme. And I can't remember if it's Heretics or Chapter House, where one of the sisters actually volunteers to become one of the axolotl tanks. Of course, that actual process is never really fleshed out. The implications of that it's not quite a throwaway line, but you know what I mean? It's not something that Herbert spends a lot of time drawing out the true implications of what that really means. But if you start to think about it, it's sort of unsettling.
There's still the difference there that it's a volunteer.
I guess that's true, right?
It wasn't a forced thing. And that really follows completely with the idea of the Bene Gesserit, which is self-sacrifice for the greater good.
Yeah. The sort of hardcore pragmatics in the pursuit of their goals.
It sounds like the tanks, and see, this is where my knowledge of the later books fails me, but it sounds very much like what we see in the opening chapters of Brave New World when Aldous Huxley is spending time just really those first 2 or 3 chapters only looking at this process. Of course, it's a little bit maybe not as flight of fancy, but it's like, you've got these tanks and you've got the alcohol, and you can, modulate the levels of their purity and intelligence, and you can do this eugenic breeding of these different caste systems. Maybe that's not necessarily what Herbert was critiquing there, but it seems similar where Huxley is trying to create this inverted world and imagine a world without what he calls viviparous reproduction, right? This world without maternity in that sense. Or this
without chance as well. Everything's controlled. There's no opportunity for randomness. I think also by the time Herbert was writing those later books, science fiction had matured a lot in that time period. I think that's another thing to think about when he's talking about computers. What we think of as computers is not what was happening with, wouldn't be what was happening in the 1950s, the same as science fiction tropes really started, getting steam. And so that idea of the Brave New World type tampering with reproduction was showing up in more stories by the time he was writing those later ones.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't really considered that building sized computers at the time that he's writing the books. That puts an entirely different perspective on the matter, I think.
And still, he writes it in such a way that because he doesn't focus on the tech and doesn't describe it, it doesn't date itself in the same way that other authors that really want to, explain or describe something. And now we look at it and it's like, well, we have iPhones, so that's not really that, unique anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking too about, it's kind of interesting now that the movies, the Denis Villeneuve movies are out, because I'm seeing more people engaging with the conversation on forums, but they're coming to Dune from this perspective where it's like the verisimilitude is people are wanting all of these answers in a way that Herbert doesn't really give them. You know what I mean? He doesn't.
Let's just use our imagination.
Yeah, he leaves so much space for the imagination. And I think this, like, to the contemporary reader who was raised on more contemporary science fiction, they're like having short circuits, not being able to, they're like wanting these these like little micro answers to things. And it's kind of like you're missing the point of the way this thing is intended to be read, I think. But I don't know if you have thoughts or if you've seen this in your, I don't know if you even participate in any kind of discussions online outside of your courses.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's hit and miss for sure. the level of discourse online. Part of what Herbert's skill is creating this world, his world building, which is so incredibly thoughtful and good, is he doesn't fill in all those gaps. And so a good author just gives you enough detail to make you interested and engaged and feel like it's believable, but doesn't spell everything out and lets you fill in the gaps with your imagination. It's a fine balance. How much do you describe versus how much do you don't? And things like, how do people travel through space? How does the Spacing Guild work? He barely talks about that. Like barely talks about that. It's really just through Paul in the first book. And that's because he's not really interested in the how. He's interested in the effect that the guild has as an entity on the politics of the universe. And so if people are asking questions about how things work, that's actually a good sign because it means they've been pulled into the world such that they're interested and they want to actually try to figure out. Because this happens with other Star Wars and things like, oh, I wonder what was happening on that planet while this character was over here, right? And it's all fake, but your mind is pulled into that world and thinking about, I know this was happening on that planet, and then I wonder what, this Jedi was doing over there at that same time. That's the world working on you. That's a good sign, because if you're not curious and you're not interested, then that means that you kind of just absorbed it on a surface level and you're not engaged enough to care.
I mean, I think it's interesting about the Spacing Guild because the way Lynch's Dune opens up, he's got the space to like have this little slug monster. How would you describe it, Coop? It's almost like this. It's quasi-fetal. It's hard to think of how to describe the whatever is in the tank.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's like basically the thing from Lynch's first movie.
Oh, okay. From Eraserhead?
Yeah, it's almost like the Eraserhead baby over again. Just slightly modified. I don't know. I mean, they're described a little bit differently I think there's a rendering online. Let's look up Guild Navigator.
Non-Lynchian Guild Navigator.
I think once he saw the Guild Navigator that Lynch did, he kind of liked it, but he envisioned it to be more like, I think, something along.
Critics at the time described it in a lot of different ways, which I just had to quote in my adaptations book. So there's grotesque mutant, alien brain, great blob of flesh, octopus in an aquarium, pockmarked goldfish. Also, parts of the female anatomy has been described.
Okay. Well, I was thinking for a second there it sounded more Lovecraftian, but I didn't know that it was also.
Yeah, I think this kind of that's from
kind
like
of fish creature type.
Yeah.
Oh, that's from the miniseries.
Yeah, that's probably more in line with what I think he had in mind than. Even that's
semi Lovecraftian, right? Maybe not as spooky, but that's supposedly just the effects of overexposure to the spice, that it has these effects.
It mutates you. You start off human and then it mutates you, which is what Paul's kind of thinking about. Is I wonder if that's going to happen to me.
Right.
He feels himself changing and his mind's opening, and he feels like he's a freak. Well, Alia does too.
And then that really comes to a head in, Children of Dune at the end. And of course, God Emperor, maybe that's what led him, as in Herbert, down that path of mutation or something like
the
that.
apotheosis being a becoming sandworm.
Or becoming woman is especially for Leto, I think he really exemplifies that in the way that he forgoes his like male lineage and gives birth to not only metaphorically Siona through the breeding program, but then the different sandworms that contain his consciousness and so forth. We can go back to something a little bit more basic. I'm just curious, Kara, if you have a favorite book or one that you maybe find more interesting, maybe not necessarily favorite. I know people are sometimes funny about that.
Definitely Dune. The first one is definitely like, that's where it's all at. I think for me, that's where the world building is all set up. That's where all the characters are set up. Bene Gesserit were my favorite characters. Jessica, that's where has the main stage. And this is where Herbert put his most energy went into this book. This is the book he spent 5+ years researching and really putting his heart and soul into, in terms of all of the different layers, all of the depth, bringing in all of these different things. And with that hero's journey kind of adventure story on top, so that it's an engaging story. It's not bogged, well, according, like in my view, it's not bogged down by all those layers. You can read it at a very surface level, and you can also read it at different levels. And every time you read it, you can get more out of it. That's not true in the same way for the other books, even though they do have other things going on.
It's got to be the most polished, and in terms of the writing, they definitely degrade, I think, to some degree. Although I think the ideas, especially in like the second, third, and fourth books, to me get really more interesting as the series progresses. Originally, when I read Messiah, I hated it. I was like, what is this? But now over the past maybe 2 years, I've like fallen in love with it. I love it so much.
That's so interesting. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone like that one.
I know, right? It's such a tragedy, and there's so much. I don't know. There's the scene with the Duncan Idaho Gola and Paul that I just find really great.
Is it because it's such a turn? I mean, even if in the original there are hints dropped, there's a way in which, Carrie, you're just saying it, you could read it in a way that it's almost like a straight hero narrative, maybe missing some of the notes. But it does seem like Messiah is like, okay, obviously I didn't make this clear. Let me try to lay it on a little thicker. Is it because it's such a swerve from that preconceived hero quest reading of the first book that you like it so much, Coop?
Well, the first time that I read it, I think that's why I didn't like it, because it was this reversal, because I was coming more so from the Lynch book, and I think I even had that in my head as I was reading Dune.
Oh, that would be hard because he's almost a god.
Right, yeah, exactly.
The Lynch movie.
And it does come across as this more kind of bog standard hero's journey. And, I saw that when I was like 6 years old, and it just kind of blew my mind. I think I was reading Dune from that perspective. So when I got to Dune Messiah, like I totally missed the sort of point there. This question of whether not Dune, but Paul is a hero or anti-hero or what have you, I think is even this message that messiahs or heroes are bad. I don't know how consistent he really is. Like in the portrayal in Dune Messiah, I actually wind up finding Paul like significantly empathetic with him in a certain way, maybe in the way of this like Cassandra complex that I sort of find myself in. I very much liken it to Oedipus Rex, and maybe that's the surface level. Like, he goes blind at the end. He tries to avoid his fate or what have you, or Chani's fate, I should say, even more implicitly. And yet he's sort of still trapped by the whims of fate itself. So, but you also wrote a book on some of the adaptations. Do you have any that you enjoy more than others, or would you like to say anything about some of the adaptations at all?
I definitely like the miniseries the best because it's the most faithful, sticks pretty closely to the book. I really like how it presents Jessica and the Bene Gesserit, bringing out what in the book I see as a 3-dimensional view of women rather than just pigeonholing them into certain stereotypes. And it has character development, and it really brings through most of the themes from the book. The other adaptations have more of the director's vision for what they are interested in, that they push onto the story, and they sometimes take it off in quite different directions, which I understand happens in adaptation. But I will say, studying the Lynch film, I have a lot more empathy or sympathy for Lynch and what he was going through at the time as a person, and what pressures that were on him in terms of like the producers and budgets, and shooting it in Mexico at that time was just really hard. Just a lot of things went wrong. The first half of the movie, I think, aside from the weird stuff that he liked, the guild and some of those, the Harkonnen elements, aside from those, is actually quite faithful to the book. And he includes a lot of dialogue straight from the book. And also, this was the only adaptation that Herbert was alive to be a consultant on. And of course, surely he was overridden in some things based on the final product. But I appreciate that film more now, having studied it, because I think if you just see it it's easy to dismiss it as a strange take. And knowing that he was forced to cut it down for time, I think if he would have had even just an extra 20, 30 minutes to have at the end, instead of rushing everything, that it could have been more faithful to the book, and not kind of just had to turn Paul into this godlike figure, which Herbert was not happy with at the time. In terms of the new movies, I'm really happy that they're bringing people to the book. My main issue with them is how they turned the Bene Gesserit into a quite villainous group, and really alienated women from each other, alienated Jessica from Paul, and what they did with Chani. I really don't see that being empowering for women, and I'm not happy about those changes that were made, or how they dealt with religion and other things. It feels very much like kind of a postmodern take on the story, and very, very beautiful, cinematic, all those things, very beautiful. But what is there underneath the surface? A lot of that's been stripped out.
I'm ambivalent about the portrayal of the Bene Gesserit. I did sort of like they made the Bene Gesserit seem very powerful, which I enjoyed that aspect. But at the same time, I could see how, especially with contemporary audiences, like this conspiratorial bent towards the Bene Gesserit. The Missionara Productiva is canonical, and it is like this colonial mythology that they utilize for their own ends. But I don't know, it's not portrayed quite so
dynamically.
I don't know if you have thoughts.
I think you don't have to make any changes to what's in the book to make the Bene Gesserit powerful. They already are powerful. And so to me, to make changes, you would need to justify, like, okay, why are you changing it from what's already pretty good in the book? The relationship between Mohiam and Jessica is very, very fraught. Whereas in the book, it's quite, you can tell that they care for each other, and she's having to be strict, but she also, she's telling Jessica, you should train Paul in the voice because you're going to need that when you go there. She's an advisor, she's a mentor to Jessica, and in the film, very much, with the rain and the whole ambiance is very menacing, and you don't see that she is really a nice person at all. And then they also give her that, having her meet with the Baron completely does away with the whole fact that the Baron was afraid of her because she was a truthsayer, and so he couldn't kill Jessica and Paul outright. That's what gave them the chance to escape in the desert, right? That's to me, a crucial point in terms of women are usually not believed, and usually not being in that position of being an authoritative voice. And so having Mohiam sitting next to the Emperor as his kind of right-hand truthsayer causes events to happen in such a way that people are afraid of having to, she's essentially like a judge. And then having her but kind of be a part of the, scheming with the Harkonnen, to me, really undermined that whole, the Baron being afraid of her. And
you think that's just like a misreading on Villeneuve's part, or is it just a bad reading? And it's almost like that was one of the points that you brought out about her not being this villain that made me rethink about the movie and how it did fuck up her character. So I'm wondering if that's just a bad reading, a misreading, or if there's something more masculinist in the trope of turning her into just a bad guy. It flattens her out, right?
My understanding of what is being said in interviews he's not a fan of religion. And
Okay.
so you can see
Okay.
that coming through with how they deal with the Fremen. It's a very much, it's not Islam, but it still kind of is. But we're going to make Stogar into the joke character, right? We're going to make fun of him for believing. It made me quite uncomfortable watching those scenes, how they're coded, especially with the environment in the Middle East. And so the Bene Gesserit are essentially even though they don't believe in religion, they're a religious force, even though the film kind of implies that they actually do believe their own religion, which is kind of confusing. But so if you're not comfortable with the religion and you have this whole group of women that use religion as a tool, how are you going to portray that in a way that doesn't come across as just very religion bad? And I feel like the film just really leaned into that. We're just going to simplify everything. And so religion bad, these characters bad, Harkonnen bad, because look, they're so dehumanized, they're so animalistic. We want to make sure everybody knows they're really bad. And then the Fremen don't even really have their own religion. Everything's just kind of, oh, you've all been manipulated. And I think, well, the Fremen had a culture before the missionaries came, and they have a culture after the missionaries came. I mean, look at in the real world, we don't go to the Polynesian islands and say, I'm sorry, you've been colonized by Christianity. You can't have that anymore because you have to go back to your native. That'd be insulting to say that they don't have anything outside of just what was brought to them. Usually that gets integrated into a culture. That's like why we have Christmas and Easter as holidays, because Christianity took them and then sort of merged them with the local culture. And so I think it just becomes the Bene Gesserit have to kind of be this antagonistic force. Jessica has to be an antagonistic force so that we have sort of conflict and drama, and that we make sure everybody knows religion's bad. That's just such a hollowing out of the story. Women can't really be Jessica can't be his advisor and his regent and his mentor if she's the one kind of pushing him to be the bad guy. That for me is really disappointing because I can't identify with that Jessica as a role model or any kind of thing. And that's something that I think is a real miss from the book.
I think they really dropped the ball by not including Jameis's funeral because it's such an amazing scene for so many reasons. One of which is the way that Jessica kind of braces Paul and like about him killing for the first time. You know what I mean? And it's a totally different portrayal than we get in the new movie. The scene in general, like it sets up so many things of the Fremen culture economically, like not only Paul, his tears, I think is such a powerful, dramatic thing. Like it's so revered by the Fremen. He's willing to give his moisture to this man that he didn't even know. Like if you really, really think about it, that's why the Fremen in the book are so taken aback by his tears for Jameis. Not only that, but then he inherits Jameis's water rings and he asks Chani to carry those, which is an old, like unbeknownst is this sort of classic Fremen, I can't think of the word.
Courtship ritual.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So compare that with the ending of part 1 where Jessica is just a sideline character, just watching everything happen. She's not, it bothered me that she kept asking like, oh, we need to get off world. We need to get off world. And I'm thinking, that's not what a Bene Gesserit would say, right? She already knows that they're going to have to go live among these people and figure out, she's been reading them and, all those kinds of things. They just take a lot away from Jessica, which I just didn't see the justification for that, except to just really simplify. And it's hard to see how that's a more empowering story 50 plus years later than the original.
I do also agree that the Stilgar portrayal as kind of this buffoonish character was like not what I had in my head from the books at all, or even like.
Do you want to say a word or two, Kara, about portrayal of Chani? You mentioned it in passing, but I've only read the book twice now. Maybe you have to go down this road if you're going to simplify religion and put it on one side and not make it dynamic. Maybe Chani then has to be pigeonholed into being the non-believer or something like this. But it also seemed very different type of character than the book in a way that it kind of got overplayed a little bit in the movie and got a little tiresome. But I want to know, maybe I don't know how best to describe what was done to her character.
What I see happened was it's men's version of what they think women want to see to feel empowered. You read the book and you say, okay, Chani is Paul's concubine, and she's the mother of their firstborn son, and yeah, she's a good fighter, but she also is a Fremen, and so she believes in the Fremen religion, as you would expect for someone from that culture, right? And she's also Liet Kynes' daughter, so she is also a hybrid figure. She's part kind of Imperial from her dad's side, and then she's part Fremen, and so she has a lot of different facets to her character. And I think, again, with that, if you're coming from a religion bad kind of standpoint, you think, well, the best thing we can do for this Fremen woman is to liberate her. And what does that mean? Well, in the West, to liberate someone means you make them a skeptic, you make them secular, you pull them away from their religion, right? You enlighten them. This is like the project of the Western nations becoming more secular, and West versus East. We look over what's happening in the Middle East, right? And we say, oh, well, Islam seems to be causing all these problems. Never mind, there's also other religious factors. But, we kind of associate now stereotypically this religion is causing problems. And so the best thing we can do for Chani is to liberate her from that, right? And so what they do is they make her the skeptic. And so we as Western viewers presumably are supposed to identify with her as the skeptic. And so, oh, look at these poor native peoples have had this, mission. Someone's come here and pressed all these ideas on them. But here's one person who is defying the odds and doesn't believe in all that stuff, and she's going to really be that person she's the thinker, right? She's the rational person.
Right.
It is pretty heavy-handed, But to do that, right, then now you can't have her being at Paul's side as his advisor, as the person who's teaching him about the Fremen ways and about really bringing him into the culture. She becomes a religious leader in the book. She's a Sayadina. She has a place. She has a high place in that hierarchy. She's also Stilgar's niece. So in terms of family relationships and the religion, she's not just a concubine, right? She's actually a very much a Fremen leader in her own right. And so all of that's taken away pretty much to make her into this skeptic character. I was really quite taken aback in the film when they have the water of life scene when Jessica's becoming a Reverend Mother. Very marginalized scene. It's nothing at all like the book where it's a big deal. And having like Chani and her friend kind of sitting off to the side, like sort of like mocking it.
Right.
Really was just so strange to me that you would do that, because then it's like, okay, well, I guess being a Reverend Mother is kind of just like, for me, so many things were changed that the world building logic of the book broke down. If you change this and you change that, then this no longer makes sense. And so the whole Fremen culture and religion just didn't make sense. And then they kind of made that faction with the fundamentalists in the South. And they tried to kind of make it more, modern. And the logic doesn't really make sense anymore, because Paul doesn't even want to be a leader. He doesn't even want to. So it's like, well, why should we be afraid of Paul? He doesn't seem like a power hungry person at all, which was the message from the book, was that you should be aware of these characters. But he didn't really want any of that to begin with. So, what are we supposed to take away? So it just was quite.
It becomes
but then, at the ending with Chani, what they did with Chani, I guess in line with all of those things, is where she kind of stomps off. And that to me was just, I think that they think that's what women want to see, is being independent, but actually women are part of society and women are part of relationships and families. And a lot of women have children. And so that to me would have been more relatable as it is in the book than to say, here's this sort of like Western coded liberated woman. And look at her go, right? She doesn't need Paul. She doesn't need anybody.
Right.
It's like, well, that's really lonely vision if that's what it means to be an empowered woman.
That's a fair point. I read it though also as, in the book, Chani is very one-dimensional. She's not really fleshed out as a three-dimensional character as much. Like Jessica, definitely, we get to see a ton of her. We don't get to see much of Chani other than as like more or less as this appendage of Paul. And so I thought I could understand a little bit the decision to flesh out her character and make her more, especially when you have Zendaya, right, in the role, to some degree, it's good to give her a more fleshed out, have some agency rather than be this, just follow along with everything that Fremen culture and Paul's, being at Paul's side.
She's not more agential and she's not more three-dimensional in the film. She has fewer roles in the film, less to do. She's mostly just fighting.
Yeah. So they could have fleshed it out in a more coherent or quote unquote organic way.
Yeah, that's true.
Without, I think is that your point, Kara? They could have, if they wanted to give her a bigger screen time, more screen time. Maybe that's kind of what you were saying, Cooper. Like if you think of the book and her screen time, it may be less. There may be less time given to her character one on one, but on the other hand, as Kara is saying, she's already plugged into these other assemblages, these other dimensions that could have been focused on rather than completely changing her, I suppose.
Yeah.
This is why I had read a whole article on this afterward. And because I don't think she's one dimensional in the book, I think for the reasons I pointed out. And it's true, she's not the focus character. Paul and Jessica are the focus characters. But like in the scene where Jessica has to call her up from the South to try to figure out what's happened with Paul because he's been in this coma. I mean, Chani saves Paul's life. That's a big deal. Like her feminine wisdom and her instincts or whatever. There's a bonding moment with her and Jessica where Jessica sort of realizes like they're both women who have a child that they care about, and that really touching female bonding, all of that is taken away in these movies. Mm-hmm. All the women are against each other, and that's just not a liberatory view of what it means to be a woman. And so she has a lot of dimensions in the book. And I think if you watch the miniseries, that's an example of how to give Chani more screen time, but still have her be a religious figure. And she's devoted to Paul. Having a great romance, I think, we don't have to take away having great romances from women to liberate them.
Well, now I want to go read your article.
Yeah. Well, so, I went through the book, like all the places where, and all the roles Chani has, and I was just seeing that a lot online. It's like, oh, well, Chani didn't do anything in the book. She was just a little flat, like, oh, say yes to Paul. And I'm like, well, let's go look at the textual evidence, shall we?
Nice. I love it. That's what you have to do. I mean, it's a 400 or 500 page book. And so like going back just off memory, yes, but you're right. When you said that she saves Paul's life, then I start to think about, okay, yes, she did have some other activities and roles. It's sometimes easy to like miscalculate. My problem was definitely Stilgar, Chani, and now just women in general. Now that I'm thinking about it, in the Villeneuve, they're all at odds. It's like catfight kind of thing, right? And so it really does change. It really does change the kind of complexity. And yes, these are 3-hour movies, but I mean, that's 6 hours. You still could have done something. I had even forgotten that scene from the first movie, I guess, where Mohiam is like conniving with the Harkonnens, when in the book it's the exact opposite. My wife was asking me, she's like, why didn't the Harkonnens just kill Jessica and Paul? That seems really silly. And it's like, is that a Bond villain moment where I'm gonna leave Bond, handcuffed with the sharks and lasers? And I had to be like, well, I kind of cheated because I was like, well, he doesn't want to have the liability. And she's like, why? And I was like, well, and then I was like, well,
see the world building here. See,
truth, there you go. That right there, I couldn't explain it to her without being like, well, in the books, it's implied that he's worried that he's going to be called under an inquisition.
He's not supposed to be obviously involved. That's another major change. The Sardaukar is supposed to be a secret. They're supposed to be wearing Harkonnen uniforms, right? So you have the Baron obviously in league with the Emperor, then it wouldn't matter that she's his truthsayer and that she could tell on him because she's already part of it. And then like even at the end of part 2, they kind of say, oh yeah, Bene Gesserit engineered the whole thing. And I'm thinking, what? Their whole thing is subtlety and covert ops, not
there you go. Yeah. So that does break down pretty quickly. That's an inherent contradiction that ruins some of the world building. So yeah, I need to go rewatch them now and be like, here's the moment where that's when everything goes downhill, right?
The decision to not have the 2-year time gap, I think, was a major misstep in terms of the world building, and why we should be afraid of Paul is because it's not believable to me that he goes from, I don't really want power, I just want to help you guys, to now I'm a dictator and I'm bad and you should be afraid of me. Like there's no time for that to happen. There's no time for the relationship with Chani to kind of bloom. It's so compressed. It's not believable that someone would go that quickly to head of the religion or the Messiah figure in like a few months. And so I was really interested to know why they decided to shift that. Because also, when I was going back to the book, something I'd forgotten with the Chani and Paul is partly how Herbert gets over the whole fact that they're kind of like young people that fall in love quite quickly, is that Chani's already had visions because of how they use the spice in the Fremen. She's already had visions because she says to Paul something like, "How do I feel like I've known you forever?" And it's kind of this really like romantic thing that she's already seen them together in the future, and so they're able to kind of just pick up a new relationship because they've had prescience about it. And I thought that was a really kind of cool way to explain why these young people would fall so hard for each other. And it's just really disappointing that, yeah, you had these really two-star actors, and I just didn't see the chemistry or that really, nice romantic relationship. And so they put mansplaining in there, which I don't think is going to age well,
Right.
personally.
I definitely didn't like how they tried to portray it as Mohiam wanted to wipe out the Atreides for being too rebellious or something. I thought that was kind of a poor choice. I guess we can kind of move on a little bit. You did mention the Fremen religion, which I had been thinking about all week, even bugging Taylor with this notion of like, I thought it was very interesting, Herbert's concept of, and this like materialist approach to the story, the way that the Fremen worship of Shai Hulud exemplifies that, in the sense of like, they take this terrifying, threatening creature that would, if they were in the open desert, it could kill them, right? It's a destructive beast, right? But they're able to take that negative and turn it into a positive, into we'll revere and we'll worship this destructive force as our god, because you might be able to speak to a little bit about how much the Fremen are aware of the spice relationship to the worms, because there's so much different media in my head, I can't recall exactly how it's explained in the books, because I think that obviously is an important component of the idea of the maker, right? The sandworms making the spice.
That's in the appendix, where he talks about the ecology and how Leah Kynes' father, Pardot Kynes, was the one who was doing all the scientific research, and then stumbled across this idea of this kind of ecological cycle. And I guess it's implied because he really then wanted to teach ecological literacy to the Fremen so that he could use the Fremen as this ecological force to transform the planet. I would presume the Fremen are aware of the cycle, and they certainly use spice a lot in their culture, and they also use it to bribe the guilds, and so they're very much in the know about the spice. Now, of course, they're falling into the same trap that the ecologists are, thinking that we can transform this part of the world into a waterfilled paradise, and we'll just leave this part as a desert. But actually, that's not how ecosystems work. And so if you start this chain reaction, it's not shown in the first book, but it's like kind of implied, because water is poisonous to the sandworms. So you can't really have it both ways. And that's really where the Fremen, they're lured into this promise of making an easier life for themselves, and in the process, kind of giving up on those really important parts of their culture, like, yeah, Shai Hulud and the sandworm, and being this hardy desert dweller. They're trying to trade it in for an easier life, but there's consequences of trying to reshape everything to make yourself more comfortable.
Just to draw out this notion of, I mean, this could even get us into the Machinic phylum to some degree, because that would be like the way that the environment, the Fremen's relationship to the environment, and Shai Hulud, and like incorporating that material reality into their spiritual realm, that's an example, I think, to some degree, of what Machinic phylum would be. But I think even maybe a starker example could potentially be the way that the Fremen, I have the quote here, "A man's flesh is his own, but his water belongs to the tribe." What that is a material, survival-based necessity that shapes the Fremen ethical actions. It shapes the ideology of the Fremen, or like the idealistic aspect. The non-physical realm of the Fremen is really shaped by their relationship to Arrakis as a whole. The milieu of Arrakis sets a certain ground for how the Fremen culture evolves, if that makes sense.
Very anti-individualistic, what we're
Right.
probably used to in Western culture is well, okay, unless you're a woman, your body is your own property, like your kind of sphere, and you have a certain bubble of personal space around you. And all of our kind of legal framework is set up to try to police your space and your property versus your neighbors. And this is very much kind of like, yeah, except when, yeah, if you're killed or, you call a conflict with another person and you get in a fight, like you've kind of forfeited your right to your water. And so another thing wasn't in the films was the banquet scene. And this concept kind of comes up with the banquet scene where people are making fun of or mocking Leah Kynes for this idea that like, oh, don't you guys just like drink the blood of your dead? Aren't you kind of just cannibalistic? And he's like, well, we're not going to just throw away a body that's like 75% water when we're in the desert and we don't have any water, right? We have to recycle, use the limited resources that you have. Yeah. And it definitely shapes how they, giving moisture to the dead, all those kinds of things shapes their entire way of being is this moisture conservation and by necessity. But because they do all those things, they're able to survive and actually thrive in the desert, right? And everyone underestimates them. There's not just a few thousand scattered around, there's millions of them. And they've made it. Even with all the oppression, they've made it.
Yeah, that's another great example of how like the materiality of the environment shapes their ethics and their non-physical, I should say, aspects of Fremen culture. And that, I think, to me, that is why I love Dune so much, is because of Frank Herbert's understanding of things in this regard. This is what makes it so compelling to me, because it's more in line with what I feel like to be a more correct understanding of how things work. Like, I think in the US, like broadly, it's more like ideas dominate, right? The non-physical realm is what shapes the physical world. We're not really basing our practices on how that world actually functions. Whereas in Dune, the practices are in line with how the dynamic force of Arrakis impacts the humans and vice versa, right? Like there's this two-way feedback loop, which you very astutely describe the feedback loops and draw out that conversation that Kynes has about setting in motion like something like 3% of the blah, blah, blah. This would like set a chain reaction that turns Arrakis into this like so-called paradise.
Partly why it's compelling is because Herbert drew from real world desert dwellers. And so it is believable because he looked at Native Americans, he looked at Bedouin Arabs, he looked at what do people do to survive that live more in harmony with their environment. And sometimes it's romanticized, but there's also a lot of element of truth to that. If you grow up in this sort of place, and all you have is your camel or your tent or whatever it is that is your structure, like, and that world, and how to survive there. Like we're thinking about the big caravans. Your caravan leader was everything. He was the one that knew all the places to go and where not to go and how the weather and all those kinds of things. Like you were literally in that person's hand. And so he's respected. And as we've kind of moved into cities and we get farther and farther away from the environment and farther away from our food sources and all of that stuff, it's a lot easier for us to live in the world of ideas and kind of cut ourselves off from the environment. And I think that's partly why Dune resonated so much with people, especially in the 60s and 70s, is because that environmental awareness was starting to come about. And this idea that we're so far away and we have no idea really where our food comes from and how we're polluting the environment and everything else. And this is a much tighter culture and example. And I think that's partly maybe attractive for us to read, that these people really get it.
Yeah, exactly. They're really more in communication with the environment rather than us who like the Amazon package just like it magically shows up one day and like we're totally everything's disambiguated from the actual like way that what violence allows that process to occur, similarly to the way that the great houses and the Spacing Guild, right? Like they're just extracting spice from Arrakis. They don't really care about the Fremen or about the ecology of Dune. Like even Kynes of saying, this place could be a paradise if the rulers actually cared, but no, all they want to do is grub spice.
And I think partly we're moving into so much technology now, and most of our experiences are mediated by technology in some way. And so you can just sit at home and have no interaction with any other humans and yet get all the things you need because we have technology that allows you to do a few clicks and get things. And we could see some detrimental effects from that happening, I think.
Herbert has this quote about ecology, like they must learn climate or something. Do you recall this? I'll have to pull it up.
I do think it's interesting that it's in the appendix that we learn the answer to the question that Coop had earlier. So just take heed, kids, read the footnotes.
I actually have never read the appendices. So I'm gonna have to go through there.
See, that breaks my heart. See, that breaks my heart because he makes fun of me for reading footnotes when we have guests on, and I'll like ask questions about these footnotes and get in the weeds, and he's not even reading the appendices to the Dune books.
So the appendices are where part of Herbert's world building is. He doesn't want to clog the main storyline up with the science and the religion, history, and background, but he puts it there at the end, and so you can get just a very condensed version of it without it taking you away from Paul's story. But it's really interesting how he talks about how the world religions kind of combined, and critiques the Bene Gesserit for not really seeing that Paul was a major threat. And if you're a hardcore Dune fan, you got to read the whole book.
Yeah.
So I found the quote is from Children of Dune. Limits of survival are set by climate, those long drifts of change which a generation may fail to notice, and it is in the extremes of climate which set the pattern. Lonely, finite humans may observe climactic provinces, fluctuations of annual weather, and occasionally may observe such things as, this is a colder year than I've ever known. Such things are sensible, but humans are seldom alerted to the shifting average through a great span of years, and it is precisely in this alerting that humans learn how to survive on any planet. They must learn climate. Rings so true, right?
He was, can I say, prescient?
Right?
And it's not long, right? The appendices, that's like 30 pages or less, right? So you could knock that out in a couple bathroom settings, man. You need to pick that.
There's no excuse. There'll be no excuse given here.
I'm not judging, but I am judging.
Some people don't read the epigraphs at the beginning of the chapter.
Really?
Oh God! No,
I was horrified.
I think those may be my favorite parts of all of the novels. Not only in the content that they say, but the fact that, and you point to this a little bit in the companion book about how like this is like a real historical, you know what I mean? This like fictionalized history that we're reading, I think is just a really cool perspective. And I mean, I don't know. I'm not that big of a sci-fi reader, so I don't know if Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke were doing similar things. Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, I think Herbert was paralleling what Asimov did, but he took it way beyond. It really gives it that epic feel.
It really does, yeah.
He's not called Paul; he's called Muad'Dib in most of those, or all those, and so it's very much like this religious prophet being talked about, and then you later find out who Arulon is, and you're like, oh, okay, interesting.
Another one of my favorite examples of this is in Children of Dune, because we similarly get these quotes from, I think it's Hark al-Ada, who we meet Farad and Carino early on in the book. It's not until the end of Children of Dune that we realize, okay, this is Hark al-Ada.
Yeah, Herbert loves that like intertextuality and all those kinds of layers. Like that's just his jam.
Another interesting aspect of like this kind of materialist philosophy that I think runs through Dune is even in the way that Paul fights against the Empire, or the Emperor specifically, is he realizes like the fulcrum of the imperial economy is predicated on spice production because this allows travel, right? So this is like, to me, this like screams Marx. This screams Lenin. Like Lenin knew that the trains were an important component of the Russian economy. You attack them at their weakest point, right? That's the sort of, that's the real fulcrum of the economy. So I don't know, that approach, I guess maybe other books have done things similarly, but I don't know, it just had such a real grounded feeling for me.
When he tells Chani, like, go have the Fremen plants this water ahead, above the spice, and we can cause this chain reaction, she says, blasphemy. That's blasphemy, right? Like what you could do if you actually let that happen. And it is very much using nature, manipulating nature, threatening to manipulate nature to get what you want. And like, unfortunately, translated to film, they turned it into like, oh, we're just going to blow stuff up with nukes, which is very much a kind of traditional violent warfare approach versus it's actually it's the threat of ending spice production. That's what the key is. And that's what gets the guild in line. Yeah. That's what gets the guild in line, who is also not appearing in the film, really.
Right. Who are like, that was one of the worst, I think, omissions for me, was the de-emphasis of, we don't really get shown why the spice is important, even for this to even be an issue, right? And also not to mention the fact that you get this a little bit in Lynch's Dune, the way that the Spacing Guild actually visit the Emperor and like, look, if you don't get spice production online, we're going to put you in a pain amplifier for the rest of your life, rather than this nebulous. I guess in part one movie they do discuss that the Guild navigators use spice. Maybe I
it's
can't
in one
even
of the
recall.
like kind of narrative, like we're telling you rather than showing you.
He's got one of those
But
like
yeah,
little video books he's
the
watching.
film book.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
Again, the stripping away the politics is hard because that's such an important part of the book. Is these factions are all fighting for spice, and that's how spice is the analogy for oil. And yeah, Paul threatens that. I mean, look what happens in the real world when someone threatens oil. Things happen.
Yeah,
right. Like,
exactly.
That's there to be seen.
I mean, I can't remember. Did I mention about the I think I did kind of talk about how the Bene Gesserit in their control or taking agency over sexual reproduction is like this progressive aspect of Herbert's writing, which then he kind of also, like, in the sense of Paul being this like male messiah, kind of undermines that to some degree. That's where Herbert is kind of like all over the place sometimes with where his positions fall. But obviously, one of the main things, which is not discussed in the movies either, is that they deny the emperor, for example, a son. So like that really underscores how powerful the Bene Gesserit really are in shaping the future of the Imperium. I mean, presumably they want their Kwisatz Haderach to be set up to take over the throne. I don't know if you want to maybe talk about anything related to reproduction and the Bene Gesserit here. We can certainly move forward.
I think it's a common critique is that, okay, well, yeah, maybe they're powerful women, but then why is the Kwisatz Haderach a man, right? That like people feel like, oh, that's a stinger to my argument. Like, okay, not.
Yeah,
gotcha moment.
Things can be more complex than that. There's kind of the Herbert reasoning, and then there's the in-universe reasoning. So from the Herbert perspective, he really wanted to study and critique this idea of these charismatic leaders or heroes. And then the people that he talked about in interviews, sort of unfortunately, and still today, a lot of these people are men. And so things like, John F. Kennedy as president, various dictators, religious prophets, Lawrence of Arabia, this is what he was working with as his model. And it doesn't really make sense because women haven't really been in these positions and had a lot of ability to be a leader, to then be critiqued, I suppose. And he also wanted to critique religion and how it could be used as a tool. And so I found the names really interesting. So looking at the name Paul, this allows him to link with the messianic figure of Paul from the Bible, and who spread Christianity and basically made Christianity into world religion. And Herbert was also very interested in Jungian psychology and genetic memory. And so from that perspective, males have XY chromosomes and females have XX. And so he was able to kind of play, he's not always consistent, but play with this idea of, you could have access to this line, but you couldn't have access to that line because you wouldn't have those chromosomes or something. But inside the story, the Bene Gesserit are very much involved in politics, but they seem to realize this idea that if you get power, it's going to corrupt you. Their strategy seems to be, of course, it's a flawed strategy, but instead of us being, us holding the power, we'll have this puppet figure and then we'll wield power through him and kind of keep ourselves at arm's length. Kind of like Liet Kynes thinks I can manipulate the planet kind of from this objective distance over here. And they're all end up being wrong. And also, I think if we think of them as a female version of the Catholic Church, it doesn't make sense for the Catholic Church does not try to become kings. It has its own realm. And so the Pope can have a lot of power, but it's not a king or not an emperor himself. And this, I think, ties into this Eastern philosophy, especially like Taoism. And so this idea of Wu Wei, or action through inaction, which seems really contradictory to us, because we think of like, if you're going to become a leader, you're going to become powerful, you have to seize it, right? And you have to maybe like take military force. Whereas this other idea is very much like, actually, by not doing things or by letting other things kind of happen, you can actually get what you want. And I think that's partly why it's been hard to interpret the Bene Gesserit, because if you're looking for a take charge kind of woman, you're not going to find it. You're going to find a lot more subtle kind of working behind the scenes. And what ultimately Herbert shows us is the Bene Gesserit are fallible and they lose control over this planned puppet, this planned prophet figure. And so just like every other group, they are not able to control. That's how I kind of think about does having it be a male prophet undermine their whole thing? No, I don't think it in any way. They're working within the reality of the system that Herbert's designed. And still today, women have to work within a patriarchal system. And it doesn't mean becoming the leader is always the option that's going to get you what you want. That's my take on it.
Herbert has that great quote. It's something like, if you grasp power too tightly, then you have to grasp it very softly or something like that, or it'll like overcome you. This is kind of building on this discussion of gender and politics. What do you think about the fish speaker army that Leto II has in God Emperors? I don't know if that's something you want to even get into.
I mean, there's a reason why I haven't really talked about the fish speakers in my research. They're not Bene Gesserit, and so they don't fit with the same kind of things that I'm talking about, the Bene Gesserit. They're really interesting, but they maybe don't necessarily have the greatest perspective in terms of they're kind of empowering women militarily, but then there's also all that stuff about sexuality, and it gets kind of murky and messy. So I will say, yeah, I've kind of avoided it because it's messy and not necessarily showing women in the same kind of light that the Bene Gesserit have. And they also kind of devolved into the Honor Martyrs later, which is the bad guys. I probably should write about the fish speakers at some point, but
yeah, I mean, they're not really
hard to analyze.
Yeah, I mean, we're not really given that much information.
No.
They're not as fleshed out as any of the other groups. One of the things that stood out to me with regard to the fish speakers is like Leto's kind of talking about how like he's kind of essentializing men in this regard. All male armies, they turn on themselves, they turn on their society, they look for an enemy, etc., which maybe kind of falls into this kind of essentialism to some degree.
Yeah, I don't think his philosophical take is as tight when it comes to the later books. Yeah, I've kind of avoided it for sure.
I did want to get your take, Kara, on, is it Brian? Is that the son's name? Brian Herbert?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like a couple dozen other books? I don't know how many there are now, but there's a lot.
There's a lot.
Have you looked at any of them? Is it not your, I know Coop has his feelings that it's not for him, but is there anything worthwhile there, or is it just kind of non-canonical and needs to be ignored? Or
I started reading some of the earlier ones back when I was doing when I first started studying Dune, because they are part of the same world. From an academic literary perspective, they're not on the same kind of level in terms of like the depth and all of the layers. They're more kind of general fiction or general science fiction kind of books. Like Kevin J. Anderson has written Star Wars novels in the Star Wars universe, which I've read. And the main reason I stopped reading them at that point was it was starting to kind of bleed over into my understanding of Frank Herbert's story. And so I didn't want to get confused with plot events. Like, I think that like they speculate on things like Jessica's mother and stuff. And so I was worried that I was going to start kind of mixing the Brian and the Frank stuff. Yeah. And I decided to not go. And I think they seem to like the robots kind of angle, which is more like traditional sci-fi. And so
going back to like the Butlerian jihad, and it's
right. Yeah, they have the way prequels, and then when they kind of finished off post what Herbert wasn't able to write, the seventh book. Partly why I like Dune is it doesn't have robots and it's not stereotypical sci-fi, and so that kind of thing doesn't really appeal to me. And also wouldn't necessarily say that I'm impressed with the takes on women. I know men can write great female characters, which Frank did, but I think part of that was the influence of Beverly Herbert coming through with the Jessica character.
Right.
So it's hard for me when I say like, oh, I'm studying Dune and I recommend Dune, and then people look Dune up and they're like, oh, there's like a billion things. Like, which one? I was like, there's only one Dune, right? There's only one Dune. Like, just start with the Dune, but people get overwhelmed and they think like, if I start in on this series, I'm going to have to read dozens of books. So that's, I like that perspective.
I like cordoning off, the other works and just be like, no, just stick to Frank. You'll be good. Because,
I know, but if you're a lay person coming to it and you don't have anyone guiding you, you don't really, if you think like, oh, I should read the prequels first because that's the whole debate within Star Wars.
I see what you mean.
Where do you start with Star Wars? Like, I think you start with like Star Wars, there's one Star Wars. But, some people come to it for the prequels, and then that totally shapes how they see the original.
Man, okay, I
It's
see
a
what you mean.
travesty.
So that would maybe sully the waters a little bit. If you were to start with the prequels, you would. That's a good point. I didn't think about that. The very fact that they were writing prequels, and so you might think you start with that, but no, that's too bad. I mean, I guess that's part of the piggybacking off of what your father did, and I mean, I guess that's his right if anyone has that right. But if you're not doing it well, and you're
and then we're going to have the Prophecy series, which is based off of one of those, and so for new people coming in who've only seen the Villeneuve movies, like this to them will be Dune. Based on what I saw with the women in these movies, I'm
not
nervous about what they're going to do about going back to the origins of the Bene Gesserit if their vision of the Bene Gesserit is so different from what I see it as is in the book.
Is this going to be on HBO or?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Max. Okay. I think Max. I don't know if it's specifically
Max.
HBO,
it's like calling Twitter X. I just
Well, I think HBO actually still exists as a production arm.
Okay.
But then you have Max, which is its own separate entity, because like the Game of Thrones IP stuff is all housed under HBO still, specifically.
Right. Shut up, nerd.
So it's weird with, but
and Game of Thrones is doing prequels now too. House of the
Dragon,
yeah.
Speaking of
love.
Prequels, that's season 2 starts tomorrow. So or tonight for you, right? I guess I don't know when. Yeah. Maybe you have to wait. I don't know.
Depends when it drops. It depends if it drops like Eastern time.
Right.
Or West Coast.
But
that's an example of like women, right? Women having to maneuver, within these kind of structures.
That's true. Yeah.
And who's going to inherit and, alliances and marriages. Dune belongs as a long mini series where all of those things can be fleshed out. I mean, Game of Thrones proves it can be done. It can be done well.
Maybe we'll get lucky in some of the later books. We'll get the series treatment, but then again, who knows how well that would come off.
Based on all we've discussed about the Villeneuve movies, how are you feeling about Dune Messiah as the bookend?
Right. Yeah.
I guess maybe you've lost all enthusiasm for
well, if they're going to go off book, which they've totally done, then I don't really know what they're going to put in there because they seem to have their own ideas about what Chani's going to be doing. And like if the rumor that like Chani's going to go start this like rival band of a Fremen or something. I mean, that's just, I guess they just just fictionalize something.
They're just making shit up. Yeah.
Yeah. But then it won't really be, I mean, Dune Messiah, I don't think it's not an easy take. There's a lot of weird, like Lynch would have been the one to do Dune Messiah because the Talaxu are really weird. And there's all kinds of characters kind of getting, manipulated by other characters, and it's Paul's downfall. And so I don't know how, if what you want to do is simplify everything and, just make it beautiful and cinematic, how are you going to deal with those strange elements? Yeah.
Lynch would have handled the Golas pretty well, right, Coop? I can imagine.
Yeah. Messiah is a slow-moving tragedy. I don't see how you can make that into a blockbuster. I mean, it's a beautiful tragedy story that I'm just going to probably cringe a lot to see turned into this mess. But one thing, Kara, I forgot to follow up on was the course that you offer on Dune.
Yeah.
If you'd want to speak to that a little bit, we definitely like to give you the opportunity. And then I suppose to wrap us up, if you have anything forthcoming or like in the future that you're working on that you'd like to tease or like point us to, or like if you want to share any information about where we can find your work, etc., please feel free to have that opportunity.
Your platform.
The Dune 101, of course, is essentially the critical companion turned into a course, essentially like PowerPoint slides and me talking to them, talking through the key points from the book that I found interesting. There is so much going on with Dune, and I will say it was really difficult to have to just choose what to talk about in the critical companion because it's part of a series, and so we had a set word limit.
Yeah, I assumed you did.
Yeah, you had to pick, I think, 5 key themes from whatever major science fiction work that you're choosing. And you'll notice I did not choose philosophy because that one has been like done to death. And so I thought, I don't need to. I want to talk about, I've always wanted to write about polymasculinity because probably somewhat unsurprisingly, none of the male authors who write about Dune have wanted to wade into that topic. And so that was finally my chance. I've been wanting to do that for a long time. really explore, how Paul is a traditional hero, but also not a traditional hero. And then, of course, I had to have the chapter on women. Essentially, the course is for people that don't like reading or kind of like to consume things in a different format. I'd really like to do some courses on the adaptations now that I've studied them, and now that so many people are watching the Villeneuve films and then thinking, wait, well, what about that and this and that and nothing, all the things that weren't explained, really having kind of unpacking the story or unpacking the films. I think there's a lot of scope for that. So I'm hoping to do that in the future. My next book, I'm planning on looking at Dune Part 2, the Children of Dune miniseries, and then doing a comparative study across all the adaptations now that they're all out. I wrote a 5-part series on the Fremen blog series, and the first one of those just got published on Dune Newsnet. There'll be more of those. And again, this is kind of like my Chani article where I was so frustrated with people saying the Fremen are one-dimensional and the Fremen are just a analogy for Middle Eastern people, and they had to change them all. And I thought, well, let's go back to the text. And there's actually a lot about the Fremen hidden in little pockets throughout Dune. I look at how are they characterized, and then, are they orientalized? If so, in what ways? And then looking at how does the film treat them, and kind of what I think about what they did to change their characterization. That's another. So I wrote that a couple months ago, but it's just starting to come out now. If you want to learn more about what's actually happening in the book with the characters that were heavily changed, those are a good place to start. Because the Fremen actually surprisingly have not been written about very much at all either, and I've wanted to write about them for some time. I've written about kind of Lawrence of Arabia and Paul perspective. Oh, that's another thing I have coming out. I wrote an essay on Lawrence of Arabia and Paul, and how similar Paul is or isn't to the character kind of from the film, but also more 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And that's going to be coming out as a limited edition chapbook next year from this UK publisher. And I've also added some content that I didn't publish in the original essay about sandworms and camels. There's also a linkage there with how the sandworms are used. Various things coming out, and I plan on blogging about prophecy when that comes out as well, because I'm sure there will be lots to talk about with the women.
Do we know when that's coming out yet? I don't
think they've.
The trailer just came out. I don't think they've specified a date.
Okay.
Not that I recall.
Well, have you read the Dune and Philosophy book, the collection of essays?
Yeah, we read one essay and had one author from that collection on.
Tim Wakefield?
It was James Wakefield. James Wakefield. It was like the Tyrant and something.
Political ontology stuff. So was it like
something
Schmidt
along that?
It was like Schmidt, and it was pretty decent. But no, we didn't look at anything else.
I haven't read the whole book.
Some of those other. The one I have in there, I don't know if you're familiar with Iris Marion Young and Throwing Like a Girl. It's a really good essay. And I've always wanted to write about the Bene Gesserit kind of from that perspective. So that was my chance too. So I have Simone de Beauvoir, but also essentially she talks about when you're a girl, you kind of, from the time when you're a little girl, you already start having all of these kind of gendered notions of how you move your body. And so she compares this idea of like throwing like a girl. So girls tend to, this is like in general in the West, or her perspective, tend to kind of, they'll stand like quite still. And if you ask them to like throw a ball, they'll kind of take the ball and throw it like this. They just kind of keep your body still and it's become like a derogatory term, like that you throw like a girl, right? Like you can't really throw really well. So she talks about, well, how do boys throw? And she's like, talks about this idea, like boys, their whole body goes into it, right? And you put your leg back and your whole torso and everything, like the whole body is involved in this movement. And so she's saying, well, yeah, it's no wonder that women are socialized in a certain way to just keep themselves so constrained. And I thought, oh, this is totally true. This is reality to me growing up, and kind of like, especially in the sports arena, it's like, oh, nobody wants you to like be the pitcher because you're not going to be good at throwing or catching and everything. But then I related that to the Bene Gesserit. And so
the Prana
it's not
Bindu.
just that they have reproductive freedom and control. They move through the world in a way that is not afraid. That's just so powerful, because that's just not the reality for women still today, that you move around and you take up space, like manspreading, is this term of like women tend to keep yourself in this very narrow little box when you're sitting, or how you hold your arms and everything. And so I like this idea that the Bene Gesserit don't have to do that. They take up space, and they they know they can always use the voice or they can always use combat skills. And so how Jessica moves is how a woman would move if she weren't afraid.
Even in Children of Dune, whenever Jessica is like teaching Farron the BG way, she says, okay, you got to practice moving your pinky toe without moving any of the other toes or something like that, which I think kind of maybe goes a little bit in that direction.
Yeah, it's just so deliberate about thinking about your movements and using the body as an extension of yourself rather than something that gets in the way. And I really like that about the Bene Gesserit, because how do you overcome your bodily limitations and how do you overcome being pregnant? And Jessica's pregnant through quite a bit of Dune. And she's just like, doesn't stop her.
I think that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Hour. But thanks to Kara for joining us, and we'll see you all next week.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.